It's really learning how to pray from God's heart. But before we talk about that part, I want to just talk a little bit about my journey and how I got to where I am today. And so here we go. I was always raised in church, loved God, and grew up. And several years ago, probably, like 30 years ago, we were pastoring a church in Weaverville, California. And we had a friend come through that was, I would call him a prophet. And one of the things, he would come every year, and this one particular year, he was calling people forward to prophesy over them their gifts. And I was at that time raising babies and real involved in all of that, and my life was absorbed with that. And he called me out that day. It was a Sunday morning service. I'll never, ever, ever forget it. He called me out, and I was actually sitting, we were having a church in the theater, and I was sitting in the balcony. And he called me down, and as I was walking down the aisle to get prayed over, I said this to God: God, I'll take any gift but intercession. And I have kind of a discerning gift, so I really kind of knew that that's what it was going to be, but inside I'm like, oh. Now, why would I say that? Because growing up in the church, the people that we would label intercessors or prophetic intercessors were a lot of the time, just to be honest with you, depressed. And they always seemed to be carrying some heavy burden on their shoulders, and you could see it all over their faces. And I just grew up thinking, I don't want to be like that. And so, sure enough, when I got down to the front, the first words out of his mouth, he says, I see you as an intercessor. And he said, but not for this time, but there's a time coming. And when he said that part, I went, whew, I'll just put that thing up on the shelf, and we'll just see what happens. And so I did. I just kind of put it on the shelf. And 18 years ago, I woke up one morning, and the Lord spoke to me. And I felt like he said, I want you to carry joy and intercession. And my first question to him was, is that possible? Because of the way I had perceived it. And he said, I felt like he said, I'm going to take you on this journey, and I'm going to show you that it's possible to be joyful and be an intercessor. Now, I would not consider myself at that time to be an intercessor. I prayed. When I was a little girl, my mom said I asked for prayer for everything. Even when I was hurt, I would come and ask her to pray for me. And any of my friends in the neighborhood would get hurt, I'd have her praying for them. And it was always in me. But I would not consider myself an intercessor, and nor did I really understand it. And so I like everyone else, I signed the bottom of an empty white page and said, yes, Jesus, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And so the Lord began to take me on this journey. But I had an encounter that I want to talk about. And this encounter happened in Toronto during the renewal time, where the Father was coming with his great love and demonstrating it and showing it to people. And Bill and I went there, and it was a Sunday night service. And the service was over, and if you ever were at Toronto during the renewal time, whenever the service ended, there were bodies everywhere. And God was touching people. They would get prayed for, they would fall on the floor, they would roll. Maybe that's how we got the holy roller thing. I remember as a little girl at the altar watching people do all that stuff and just being, just like, wow. And so this was happening in Toronto, and Bill and I were walking out, and we were up at the front, and we walked to the back of the church. And in the back of the church, there was this huge area, and seriously, there were bodies everywhere. They were getting touched by God. And I noticed that there was one gentleman walking around, and he was like stumbling drunk. Now, we call it being drunk in the spirit. And so when I say drunk, that's what I mean. And so that's what he was doing, and he was walking around touching people, and they would just go a little crazy. And as Bill and I walked out, my arm was in his arm, and we began to walk, and I noticed this gentleman, and that guy made eye contact with me, and he beelined right towards me. Now, I was minding my own business. We were leaving. That was it. Nothing spectacular had happened to me or anything. And he headed towards me, got over to me, and just touched my arm. And when he touched my arm, I flew to the ground. And I began shaking violently all over the floor. Not just a little tremor. I was violent all over the floor. And my husband said he's never seen anything like it since. And I was in no control of my body, but I was in complete control of my thoughts. And I knew that this was God. I knew that it was sovereign. I knew that God was doing something, but I had no clue what was happening to me. And it went on for 20, 25 minutes. And at one point, the lady came over and said, "Are you in shape? Like, are you in good shape?" And I was at the time, and I said, "Yes." And she goes, "Then more, Lord." And off I went again. And obviously, Bill had to let go of me. It was so violent. And about 20, 25 minutes into it, my parents were there also. And my dad and my husband helped me up off the floor, and we walked back to the hotel with me hanging on just like a limp noodle all the way back to the hotel, totally enveloped in God and loving every second of it. The next day, we got to the service, and I sat down. And a gentleman got up to speak in it. To this day, I don't remember who it was. And the first words out of his mouth, I went to the floor. And I just began weeping and weeping and weeping. You know how you have those experiences, and when you talk about them, they come back to you, and all that emotion just comes back? Yeah. And I laid on the floor weeping, and I said, "God, what happened to me yesterday? What were you doing?" And this is what I felt like he said. He said, "I was taking out of you the lies that you believed about yourself and birthing those things that were in you that I want you to be." Now, let me explain why. When I was a little girl, I still am, but when I was a little girl, I was labeled shy. And when you have a quiet spirit, that's what you get labeled a lot of times, is people just think you're shy and you don't have anything to say. And so I grew up with that. My parents didn't do that to me, but other people would do that to me, and they would just say, "You're shy, you don't have anything to say, why don't you don't talk," and all this. And so when you get told that kind of stuff over and over again, that actually you become that. And so I became this shy person, very introverted, was not able to speak in public. Growing up in school, I'd much rather take an F than have to get up and do any type of oral report. It was just terrifying to me. And that, I believe, that shyness became a stronghold over my life. And that night on the floor in Toronto, God shook that violently out of me because I needed to step into who I was. And so from then on, my husband says, I was a different person. I felt different. I felt this boldness come on me. I still had a quiet spirit, but I had this boldness come on me like I had never experienced before. I began teaching Bible studies. We went home, and I started a women's Bible study, and we just had a rockin' time. We just had a great time. We were in full-blown renewal, too, so it was just an incredible time. But the one thing that I started experiencing in all of this is intimate times with the Lord. Now, like I said, I grew up loving God. I don't remember when I got saved, but I always loved God. But I'd never fallen head over heels in love with the Holy Spirit like I had experienced in Toronto. And that continued. And I found myself just wanting to be with the Lord all the time, just spending time with Him all by myself in a secret place. And my kids were in high school at the time, so I would send them off to school, and I'd send Bill off to school, and I got to stay home at that time in my life, and I would put a worship CD on, and I would just get lost in the Lord. And that was my cradle, so to speak, of the birthing of intercession for me. And that intercession came from intimacy with the Lord.